So here is a poster for a movie that came out in the 1950s called The Red Scare. And really, this was kind of an example of how Hollywood was being influenced to make movies at the time, right? The premise of this movie was that this woman finds out that her husband actually was a communist, and it's so shocking, so scary, right? The worst thing that you could possibly imagine. Um, I'm joking, but in a lot of ways, this is the way the Red Scare was being propagated, and how communist sympathizers were being sort of looked at during this time period. This is Levittown, New York. This is kind of some of the modern suburbs that we see start to really come about after World War II. John Levitt was a developer, and he was able to put homes together that looked identical like these in less than 30 minutes, and it was really affordable. So this is kind of the beginnings of suburban sprawl that we start to see in the 1950s especially. So containment and its impact on society. Overall, the 1950s, the late 1940s, 1950s mirrored in a lot of ways the economic affluence that we see in the 1920s, right? The post-war economic boom that happened in the 1920s happens again in the 1950s, where we see a large middle class. We see the growth of suburbs like Levittown, places in Los Angeles, in Orange County, here on the West Coast. We see just a real growth of industry and suburbs. This in conjunction with the baby boom, right? We see between 1945 and 1950, the U.S. sort of seeing the greatest number of live births than it had in any previous decade, let alone the past 100 years. So this is sort of in conjunction with this kind of post-economic affluence. People are being able to afford a home, and they're sending, they're being college educated. They're getting a decent paying job. They're considered the middle class, and they're deciding to grow their families at the same time. So a lot of ways, having a home, living in the suburbs, having a large family, this was considered to be the American dream, so to speak. And this was a way that culturally the US was able to pit itself against the Soviet Union, right? If the Soviet Union um, was economically poor in comparison, well, this would be a way to glamorize capitalism to the rest of the world and say, if you are a democratic capitalist society like us, you can live like us as well. You can have a home, you can have a TV, you can have a family, you can have a car, you can have all the latest, consumer entities. So consumer culture was also very big at this time period. In this time period, most Americans owned a television. Most Americans by 1960 had a car, and this provided a lot of freedom, but also a lot of new ways in which American consumer culture was being shaped. They're going to start being shaped by the fast food industries, um, tourist attractions. Television is going to be another way in which U.S. culture becomes more homogenized. Everybody's going to have watched, episodes of Leave It to Beaver, and these are going to be things that, in a lot of ways, stood for what American culture looked like. We also see the resurgence for women, a resurgence of domesticity. And what I mean by that is that in World War II, women were encouraged to support the war, get an industry job, work outside the home. Well, after the war is over and the men return home, they expect to get their jobs back. So women lose their jobs and they're expected to, return to the homes, get married, have kids. And this was sort of promised as being, this glamorous lifestyle of domesticity. You can be a stay-at-home mom, you can take care of your husband, you can entertain, you can, you know, all of that. And there was sort of this glamorized version of what was being promised to women, something that maybe looked like this, right? American advertisers really sought to convey to women that they could enjoy their role as suburban homemakers. The reality was a little bit more like this, right? This is a photograph by Elliot Erwitt of a young mother, who has 3 kids in the picture. She's making dinner, and it was a lot more hectic, maybe, and a lot less glamorous than many young women hoped it would be. So, what we see from this is that a lot of women come to resent being forced out of their careers, forced out of their jobs outside of the home. And this is, in a lot of ways, going to set the stage for the feminist movement that we see in the late 60s and 1970s. Oops. Lastly, the civil rights movement. The Brown versus Board of Education decision was mostly symbolic in that it was announcing to the world that segregation was no longer being condoned by the federal government. But that didn't mean that states, especially in the South, in the Deep South, weren't going to do all that they could to get around having to actually abide by the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And so what we see is, a real civil rights movement gearing up to try to now enforce the decisions like Brown. So we see civil rights activists, coming together, working to desegregate, different public facilities, the buses, the housing, and so forth, with the help of, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., Ella Baker, and, Septima Clark, and all of these other really important civil rights activists later on. So we'll be kind of getting more into that, obviously, in chapter 25 when we're talking about the 1960s. But a lot of the groundwork for the civil rights movement is laid in the 1950s. And that's about it. So I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, let me know.